A bearded man stood beneath the shadow of the Blue Ridge Mountains. His eyes, fierce and prophetic, burned with conviction. He wasn't a general. He wasn't a politician. He was a preacher of steel and fire, and he had come to make war, not in a battlefield, but in the heart of slavery itself. In October 1859, John Brown led a small group of men into the quiet town of Harpers Ferry. What followed wasn't just a raid, it was a spark, a violent cry for justice. And in that echo, the nation began to fracture. This is not just a story about a failed uprising. This is the moment America looked into its soul and flinched. To understand Harpers Ferry, you must first understand John Brown. Born in 1800 in Torrington, Connecticut, Brown wasn't molded by politics. He was carved by theology. He believed slavery was not only a sin, but a war already being waged on the enslaved. And in his eyes, God demanded retaliation. Brown spent years drifting across the American frontier, farming, failing, fathering 20 children. But it was in bleeding Kansas where he emerged as a figure of terror and devotion. In 1856, amid clashes between pro- and anti-slavery settlers, Brown led the infamous Pottawatomie Massacre, executing 5 pro-slavery men with broadswords. It wasn't strategy, it was judgment. From that moment, Brown stopped trying to convince America. He resolved to confront it. By 1857, the idea of a raid was born. He envisioned a guerrilla-style campaign launching from the Appalachian Mountains, freeing enslaved people and retreating to hidden strongholds. It wasn't madness to him. It was divine warfare. To finance his plan, Brown turned to secret allies, abolitionist elites in the North. Known as the Secret Six, these wealthy men funded him quietly, fearing exposure. They were Thomas Wentworth Higginson, Theodore Parker, Franklin Sanborn, Samuel Gridley Howe, Gerrit Smith, and George Luther Stearns. Most saw Brown as a necessary evil, but to Brown, he was the sword in God's hand. In 1858, Brown took his plan to Canada, convening a convention of free blacks and abolitionists in Chatham, Ontario. There, he unveiled a provisional constitution for a new free republic to be established in the South, a nation within a nation. Many found it visionary. Others found it delusional. But Brown wasn't waiting for consensus. He was already building an army. A rented farmhouse in Maryland became his base. Hidden in the hills just a few miles from Harpers Ferry, he gathered weapons, men, and prayers. By autumn 1859, the storm was ready to break. The years following the First World War were supposed to be a time of peace. For the men returning to the small town of Centralia, Washington, that peace was shattered not by foreign enemies but by neighbors who saw them as traitors. The industrial workers of the world, or Wobblies, were already viewed with suspicion in many parts of the country. But in Centralia, the tension between the Unionists and the American Legionnaires was no longer just political or ideological. It was personal, charged by history, pride, and fear. To understand the path to violence, we must go back to the earlier assaults on the W. Hall. In 1918, during wartime patriotism and the Red Scare, the American Legion, made up of returning veterans, had attacked the Centralia Union Hall. They beat Wobblies, burned their literature, and forced them to renounce their affiliation. That event burned a deep scar into the local IWW chapter. It wasn't forgotten. It festered. When the WW rebuilt their hall in 1919 at a new location on Tower Avenue, the message was clear. They would not be pushed out again. Yet, with their return came paranoia. Rumors swirled that the Legionnaires were planning a repeat of the 1918 raid. timed with the upcoming Armistice Day parade. Enter Elmer Smith, a young and idealistic lawyer sympathetic to the Wobblies. He advised them they had the right to defend themselves and their property. This wasn't a call to arms, but a statement grounded in law. However, in a climate of deep distrust, such counsel was interpreted as permission to prepare for war. The IWWW members, including Wesley Everest, a logger and World War I veteran himself, began arming the hall. They coordinated a plan, stationing armed lookouts in buildings across from the hall, creating overlapping lines of fire, all in the belief that another illegal raid would justify self-defense. They didn't want a fight. They wanted to survive it, if it came. Meanwhile, the Legionnaires were preparing for Armistice Day celebrations, but not everyone in their ranks was content with parades and flags. Some were itching for a confrontation, believing that stamping out Bolsheviks at home was a continuation of the duty they had just fulfilled overseas. Among them were men like Warren Grimm, a respected former Army captain and star athlete, and Arthur McElfresh, both of whom had served with distinction in the war. To many in Centralia, they were heroes, but to the IW, they were symbols of looming repression. What no one knew for sure was what would happen when those two currents met on November 11th. But one thing was certain. The tension in Centralia was no longer abstract. It had a time, it had a place, and it had names and faces behind it. The town stood on the edge of a gunpowder keg. All it needed was a spark. Armistice Day dawned crisp and quiet in Centralia. It was meant to be a celebration, 1 year since the end of the Great War. Red, white, and blue bunting fluttered across storefronts. Schoolchildren lined the sidewalks. Brass bands tuned their instruments. Veterans gathered in uniform, marching with pride beneath the American flag. But in the crowd, behind the flags and music, there was something else, an undercurrent of unease. The IWW members had taken positions early. Wesley Everest was stationed behind the Union Hall, near the alley. Others, like Bert Bland and Ray Becker, were inside or positioned in buildings facing Tower Avenue. They clutched their rifles, watching, waiting, praying the Legionnaires would simply pass by. The parade began just after 2 p.m., led by the Elks, followed by school children and fraternal organizations. The American Legionnaires marched behind them, some carrying banners, others marching in formation. Spectators cheered. Camera shutters clicked. To the untrained eye, it was a perfect small-town celebration. But then, something changed. As the Legionnaires passed the IWW Hall, they suddenly broke ranks. Witnesses later claimed some peeled off and charged toward the hall, just as they had done in the 1918 raid. Others swore there was no provocation, that the gunfire came first, unprovoked. But in that moment, truth was trampled beneath gun smoke and panic. Shots rang out. The first bullet hit Warren Grimm in the chest. He staggered and fell, his medals pinned to his uniform, glinting in the autumn sun. Another Legionnaire, Arthur McElfresh, was shot through the head. Two others, Ben Casagranda and Dale Hubbard, also fell. Chaos erupted. Spectators screamed and scattered. More shots came from buildings across the street, from the IWW Hall itself. In seconds, Tower Avenue turned from parade route to war zone. Wesley Everest, seeing the commotion from behind the hall, tried to flee into the woods, but was chased down by a group of enraged Legionnaires. Armed with only a revolver, he shot one of his pursuers, Dale Hubbard, who later died of his wounds. But Everest was quickly caught, beaten, and dragged back into town. The town was no longer celebrating. It was seething. That night, Wesley Everest was dragged from his jail cell by a mob. He was beaten again, then lynched from a bridge over the Chehalis River. His body was left hanging until morning. A warning, a revenge, a message to any who would oppose the American Legion. No one was arrested for the murder of Wesley Everest. Instead, the focus turned to the IWW. The official narrative was cemented. This was a premeditated ambush, orchestrated by unpatriotic radicals. 11 Wobblies were arrested and charged with murder. Their trials would be long and controversial. But the truth of what actually triggered the gunfire remained buried beneath conflicting accounts and political agendas. What was certain is that the town of Centralia had been forever changed. The parade meant to celebrate peace had become a funeral march. In the aftermath of the violence, Centralia became the center of a storm. Reporters flooded into town. Headlines screamed of radical ambush and treachery. But behind the ink and outrage, a more complicated story struggled to surface. The state of Washington wasted no time. 11 IWW members were indicted for murder. Among them, Britt Smith, Ray Becker, Eugene Barnett, and Bert Bland. Their trials were relocated from Centralia to Montesano, a nearby town, in an attempt to ensure fairness. But fairness was elusive. From the start, the trial was steeped in bias. Prosecutors painted the Wobblies as anarchists and enemies of the American way of life. They emphasized their anti-war views and past strikes, linking them to Bolsheviks and anti-government plots. The defense, led by George Vanderveer, a staunch labor attorney, fought to shift the narrative. He argued the Wobblies had acted in self-defense, that they feared another raid like 1918, that the Legionnaires had attacked first, storming the Union Hall during the parade. Witnesses gave wildly conflicting testimonies. Some swore they saw Legionnaires break formation and charge the hall. Others insisted the gunfire came first from the Wobblies without provocation. The body of Wesley Everest loomed over the courtroom like a ghost. His lynching, though never prosecuted, was known to all. Still, no one from the mob was charged. The trial dragged on for weeks. Vanderveer meticulously presented evidence of previous harassment against the IWW. He introduced photographs of the Union Hall, testimonies of the 1918 raid, and witness accounts suggesting the Legionnaires instigated the confrontation. But the mood in the courtroom leaned toward retribution, not justice. In March 1920, 7 of the WW defendants were found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to prison. 3 were acquitted. Ray Becker, who refused a plea deal and demanded a separate trial, was eventually convicted as well, despite no direct evidence tying him to the shooting. The verdict sent a chilling message across the labor movement. Being a union member, especially one affiliated with the IWW, was now practically synonymous with sedition. Outside the courtroom, the country itself was tearing at the seams. The Centralia massacre became a symbol, one twisted to fit different agendas. To conservative newspapers, it was proof of a red threat within. To labor activists, it was a grim warning of how far the powerful would go to silence dissent. But amidst the rhetoric, the facts remained contested. No independent investigation was ever conducted. No one was held accountable for Everest's lynching, and the story, in its full complexity, faded beneath layers of myth, fear, and silence. Yet, for those who had lived through it, the wounds remained, open and unhealed. As the dust of the trial settled, the men convicted in the Centralia case began serving long prison sentences, some more than 25 years. Among them were Eugene Barnett, Britt Smith, Bert Bland, and Ray Becker. These weren't dangerous radicals in any traditional sense. They were mill workers, loggers, and organizers. Men who believed that workers deserved dignity, a voice, and fair treatment. But in the eyes of the state and much of the public, they were now criminals. Murderers, branded by ideology. Ray Becker, perhaps the most defiant, stood out. He had refused all deals, demanded a fair trial, and ultimately paid with decades of his life. Despite efforts from supporters to win his release, he remained incarcerated longer than any other defendant. He was eventually released, years after his health had deteriorated, but never gave up his belief that the events of Armistice Day were an act of defense, not aggression. As the 1920s wore on, the power of the IWW waned. Government repression, corporate pressure, and internal divisions fractured the once vibrant organization. In the wake of Centralia, union halls were shuttered across the country. Organizers were arrested, deported, or driven underground. The Wobblies became cautionary ghosts from a time when speaking up for your rights could cost you everything. The town of Centralia itself tried to bury the memory. For decades, the events of 1919 were barely spoken of publicly. The lynching of Wesley Everest was left unpunished and largely unacknowledged. His grave, tucked in a cemetery outside of town, became a quiet pilgrimage site for Union men and women who hadn't forgotten. Even as time marched forward, the story refused to fully fade. In the 1960s and 70s, new generations of labor activists began to revisit the Centralia massacre. Books were written. Documents were uncovered. A monument to Everest was finally erected, not by the state, but by union workers determined to preserve the truth. Still, the division over what really happened persisted. To some, Centralia remained a justified defense against a violent mob. To others, it was a cold-blooded ambush by radicals. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between, muddied by ideology, fear, and the silence of those who benefited from forgetting. Centralia was not just an incident. It was a fracture point, a warning of what happens when fear overrides justice, when labor is treated as threat rather than partner, and when violence becomes the language of politics. Over a century has passed since the events of Armistice Day in 1919, yet the shadow of the Centralia massacre still lingers. It haunts the labor movement, flickers in the pages of forgotten history books, and whispers through the rusted ruins of old timber mills. What happened that day was not merely a clash between patriots and radicals. It was a warning shot across the bow of American democracy, a signal of how far fear, propaganda, and power can push a society teetering on the edge. Wesley Everest's lynching, his battered body left to hang from a bridge, became one of the most brutal symbols of anti-labor violence in American history. His name, once demonized in the press, is now remembered among labor martyrs, a man who refused to apologize for defending himself and his union. Ray Becker, the last man imprisoned from the incident, never recanted. He maintained until his death that he was innocent and that the IWW members had been provoked, hunted, and scapegoated. In his defiance, he became a living reminder that truth can endure even when buried under decades of state suppression and media distortion. The legacy of the Centralia massacre reshaped labor organizing across the Pacific Northwest. The IWW never fully recovered, but their spirit passed into other movements. The CIO, the AFL, and countless independent unions carried forward the belief that workers had the right to organize, to strike, to speak, and in towns like Centralia, where silence once reigned, new voices emerged to tell the full story. Modern historians, such as Tom Copeland and Harvey O'Connor, dug deep into the court records, personal testimonies, and long-hidden letters to expose the contradictions in the official version. Their work, along with labor advocates, helped reframe the massacre, not as a cautionary tale of radicalism, but as a case study in injustice and corporate overreach. Today, Centralia hosts annual memorials for Wesley Everest. The once-forgotten Union man is honored with plaques and remembrance ceremonies, not as a villain, but as a man caught in the storm of history. But perhaps the most enduring legacy is the question the massacre continues to pose. How should a nation balance dissent and order? When does defense become aggression? And what happens when the institutions meant to protect rights instead serve to crush them? The ghosts of Centralia still walk the tracks and riverbanks. They speak not just of what happened there, but of what could happen anywhere when truth is left to die quietly and justice is shaped by those in power.